My name is Ethan Carter. At 34, I managed logistics systems that moved nearly $80 million of inventory every week across 14 distribution centers in 5 states. My brother called me the family disappointment. He said it at his own promotion party in front of more than 200 guests, senior executives, board members, major clients, and the CEO of the company we both worked for. My parents laughed. My mother even added her favorite line, the one she'd been repeating for years. Then the CEO looked at me, went completely still, and asked a question that changed the entire evening. A question my brother couldn't answer. What happened after that? What it cost Ryan? What it forced my parents to finally confront? And why I walked out of that ballroom without saying, "I told you so," even once. None of us saw coming, least of all me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand how my family decided who was successful long before either of us became adults. In the Carter family, there was always one star, Ryan, the son everyone noticed, the son everyone celebrated. And after enough years, that story became so familiar that nobody bothered questioning it. Not my parents, not our friends, not even most people at the company where we both worked. What nobody knew was that 3 days before Ryan's promotion party, someone inside the executive office reopened an old project file. A file connected to the biggest success story of Ryan's career. At the time, I had no idea those documents were about to raise questions nobody wanted to ask. Questions that would eventually stop a celebration, rewrite a 5-year-old story, and turn Ryan's biggest night into something entirely different. 3 weeks before Ryan's promotion party, I was sitting in my office reviewing inventory forecasts when my phone buzzed. The Carter family group chat. The message came from my mother. "Everyone needs to be at Ryan's party." A few seconds later, Ryan added, "Please don't be late. The executive team will be there." Of course they would. The entire event was built around Ryan's promotion to vice president. My mother had been talking about it for weeks. Every family conversation somehow became another opportunity to celebrate his success. A minute later, my father sent a message. "It would mean a lot if you came." I stared at the screen for a moment. Because in my family, that sentence always meant the same thing. Support Ryan, celebrate Ryan, make Ryan look good. I put my phone down and went back to work. At the time, I was helping coordinate operations across 14 distribution centers. A routing issue in Tennessee had delayed several high-priority shipments, and my team was trying to prevent problems from spreading across multiple states. Nobody in my family understood what I actually did. Or maybe they never cared enough to ask. To them, Ryan was the successful son. I was simply Ethan, the quiet brother. Growing up, Ryan and I occupied very different roles inside the family. Ryan attracted attention naturally. People remembered him. People talked about him. My mother loved that. I preferred solving problems, building systems, fixing things before they became emergencies. The Sunday before the promotion party, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. Ryan was already there, naturally. Halfway through the meal, one of my father's friends turned toward me. "So, Ethan, how's work going?" Before I could answer, my mother smiled. "Oh, Ethan handles operations somewhere." Somewhere. That was the entire explanation. Then she pointed toward Ryan. "But this one is changing the company." Everyone laughed. Ryan smiled modestly. The conversation moved on, just like it always did. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back porch. A few minutes later, my father joined me. After a long silence, he sighed. "You know how much this promotion means to Ryan," That sentence stayed with me during the drive home, because Ryan's promotion wasn't just a promotion anymore. It had become a family achievement, a victory everyone had already decided belonged to him. What none of them knew was that, around the same time, people inside the company had quietly started revisiting an old project. A project that played a major role in Ryan's rise through the organization. And within a few days, questions nobody expected would begin surfacing. 3 days before the promotion party, I had no idea anyone was reviewing old project files. I was too busy dealing with work. A supplier issue in Georgia had started affecting inventory flow across several distribution centers, and my team was trying to prevent delays before the weekend. By the time I checked my phone that evening, Ryan had sent 3 messages. The first was a reminder about the party. The second was a seating chart. The third was private. Need a favor. I stared at the message for a moment. Ryan rarely asked me for favors, at least not directly. I called him. He answered almost immediately. "Hey," he said, "quick question." Whenever Ryan said quick question, it usually wasn't quick. "What is it?" "I've got a presentation for the promotion event." Of course he did. Ryan loved presentations, loved stages, loved being the person everyone watched. "I just need you to check a few operational numbers." I stayed quiet. Then he added, "You know that stuff better than I do." That almost made me laugh, because it was probably the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. 20 minutes later, the slides arrived in my inbox. I opened them while eating dinner. The moment I started reading, my stomach tightened. The presentation wasn't about his new position. It was about the project. The same project that had launched his career 5 years earlier. Page after page described the system that supposedly saved one of the company's biggest contracts. The routing strategy, the operational redesign, the implementation plan. Everything was there. And every accomplishment was attached to Ryan's name. No mention of me. No mention of the operations team. No mention of the people who actually built it. Just Ryan. Again. I sat there staring at the screen for several minutes. Not angry. Just tired. Because after 5 years, the story had been repeated so many times that nobody questioned it anymore. Not my family. Not most of the company. And certainly not Ryan. The next morning, I sent Ryan a list of corrections. Nothing dramatic. A few inaccurate numbers. Several outdated projections. 2 assumptions that no longer matched current operations. I figured that would be the end of it. An hour later, my phone rang. "Ryan, got your notes," he said. "You missed a few things." Silence. Then he laughed lightly. "That's why I sent it to you." The way he said it bothered me. Not because he was asking for help, because he spoke like the project still belonged to him. Like I was just a technical editor reviewing someone else's work. We talked for another 10 minutes. Every time I asked a question about the presentation, Ryan answered vaguely. Leadership decisions, strategic direction, executive planning. The same language he always used whenever details became uncomfortable. Finally, I asked something simple. "Are you going to mention the operations team?" The line went quiet, only for a second, but I noticed. Then Ryan answered. People already know it was a team effort. That wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. A few hours later, my mother called, not to ask about work, not to ask how I was doing, to discuss the party. Apparently, several executives would be attending, some board members too. The CEO was expected to give a short speech. My mother sounded more excited than if she had been receiving the promotion herself. Then she said something that stuck with me. Try not to disappear into a corner this time. I laughed softly. I'll do my best. I'm serious, Ethan. This is Ryan's night. There it was, the reminder, the role assignment. The same one I'd been given my entire life. Supportive brother, background character, audience member. After the call ended, I sat at my desk, staring at the window for a few moments. Because deep down, I already knew what the party would look like. Ryan telling the story, my parents celebrating it, everyone applauding, and me sitting somewhere in the crowd listening to another version of a success story that was never entirely his to begin with. The day before the promotion party, I stopped by headquarters to attend a quarterly operations meeting. Normally, I spent most of my time at distribution centers. Corporate meetings weren't really my thing. Too many presentations, too little actual work. When I arrived, Ryan was already there, standing near the conference room doors talking to a group of managers, laughing, telling stories, working the room the way he always did. A few people noticed me and nodded politely. Ryan spotted me almost immediately. "There he is," he said. Then he put a hand on my shoulder and turned toward the group. "This guy keeps the trains running." Everyone laughed. It sounded like a compliment. Maybe it was supposed to be. But I noticed something. Nobody asked what I actually did. Nobody asked what my team handled. The conversation stayed focused on Ryan, his promotion, his leadership, his future. I stood there for a few minutes listening before excusing myself. As I walked away, I heard one of the managers congratulate Ryan again. "Nobody deserves this more than you." Ryan thanked him, didn't hesitate, didn't correct him, didn't mention the hundreds of people whose work made his success possible. That shouldn't have bothered me, but for some reason it did. Later that afternoon, I ran into Karen Whitmore, one of the company's senior directors. She had been around long enough to remember the contract crisis 5 years earlier. We spoke for a few minutes about inventory forecasts and staffing issues. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, "Going to Ryan's party tomorrow?" "Apparently," she smiled. I wouldn't miss it. Something about the way she said it felt strange, like she knew something I didn't. Before I could ask, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then back at me. "You know," she said quietly, "it's funny how old files can suddenly become important again." I frowned. What does that mean? But she was already gathering her things. "See you tomorrow, Ethan." Then she walked away, leaving me standing there wondering why, for the first time in years, people inside the company were suddenly talking about the past. That night, I tried not to think about it. Karen's comment, the old files, the strange look she gave me before leaving. I told myself it probably meant nothing. People inside large companies talk in vague hints all the time. By the next afternoon, I was standing in a hotel ballroom downtown. The promotion party had already started. Servers moved through the crowd carrying drinks while executives gathered near the stage. Everything looked expensive, carefully planned. Ryan loved that kind of thing. The room was packed with managers, directors, clients, and senior leadership. My mother looked happier than I had seen her in years. She spent most of the evening introducing herself to people, telling stories about Ryan, repeating the same accomplishments over and over. Meanwhile, I stayed near the back of the room, exactly where everyone expected me to be. At one point, Ryan walked over carrying a glass of champagne. "You made it." I said I would. He smiled, then lowered his voice slightly. "Try to stay visible tonight," I laughed. "That's usually your job." Ryan grinned. Someone has to represent the family. Then he walked away before I could answer. Represent the family. The phrase stayed in my head longer than it should have, because deep down, I knew what it meant. Ryan wasn't just celebrating a promotion tonight. He was celebrating the story everyone believed about him. The rising executive, the company's success story, the future leader. Across the room, I noticed several senior executives talking quietly near one of the reception tables. Karen was standing with them, so was the CEO. For a brief moment, Karen looked in my direction. Then she said something to the group. The CEO turned slightly and glanced across the ballroom, toward me. Only for a second, but it was enough to leave me with an uncomfortable feeling. And judging by the confidence on Ryan's face, he had absolutely no idea that somewhere inside this building, a few people had started asking questions that could change his entire story. And before the night was over, those questions were finally going to be answered. The official program started around 7. By then, most of the ballroom was full. Executives clustered near the stage. Managers gathered around cocktail tables. Clients and board members moved through the crowd, exchanging handshakes and congratulations. The atmosphere felt less like a promotion party and more like a victory lap. Ryan loved every second of it. From where I stood, I watched him work the room with effortless confidence. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. Someone congratulated him. Someone praised his leadership. Someone mentioned the project. The project. 5 years later, people were still talking about it. The contract crisis. The operational turnaround. The system that supposedly saved millions. Ryan accepted every compliment with practiced humility. Just enough modesty to sound believable, not enough to correct anyone. Then my mother found me. Of course she did. "Ethan," she said, pulling me toward a group of guests. "There you are." Before I could object, she started introducing me. "This is my younger son." Pause. Small smile. The quiet one. Everyone laughed politely. Then she immediately shifted the conversation back to Ryan, the promotion, the leadership role, the bright future ahead. I stood there for a few minutes listening before excusing myself. Nothing new, nothing surprising, just another version of a scene I'd lived through my entire life. A few minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The program was beginning. Guests started moving toward their tables. The stage lights came on. Ryan took his seat near the front, beside several senior executives. My parents sat proudly at a nearby table. I ended up toward the back, exactly where nobody expected to hear from me. The first few speeches were predictable. A senior manager spoke about company growth. Another executive discussed future expansion. Then Karen Whitmore stepped onto the stage. The same Karen who had spoken to me the day before. She congratulated Ryan, praised his work ethic, mentioned his career progression. The audience applauded. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. Near the end of her speech, Karen paused, looked down briefly at her notes, then smiled. "You know," she said, "reviewing the company's history this week reminded me of something." The room stayed quiet. It reminded me how easy it is for organizations to remember outcomes and forget details. Something about the way she said it made me sit up slightly. Several executives exchanged glances. Karen continued, 5 years ago, this company faced one of the most challenging operational crises in its history. The project. Immediately, I knew where she was going. So did Ryan. I noticed him straighten in his chair, probably expecting another public celebration of the story everyone already knew. Instead, Karen looked toward one of the tables near the stage, toward the CEO. Then she smiled again. This week, while preparing for tonight, some of us revisited the original project documentation. The room remained silent. But something had changed. I could feel it. The atmosphere, the attention, the expectation. Ryan wasn't smiling anymore, not completely. Then Karen stepped away from the podium. "Which is why," she said, "I think our CEO would like to say a few words." The applause started immediately. The CEO stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the microphone. For some reason, my stomach tightened. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the way Karen looked at him. Maybe it was the conversations I'd noticed earlier. Or maybe it was because, for the first time all evening, nothing felt scripted anymore. The CEO reached the podium, looked across the ballroom, then down at a folder in his hands. A folder thick with printed documents, old documents, project documents. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked up, not at Ryan, not at my parents, at me. And suddenly, the entire room felt very quiet. The CEO stood at the podium and opened the folder in his hands. "We're here tonight to celebrate Ryan's promotion." The room applauded. Ryan smiled. My mother looked proud. Everything seemed normal. Then the CEO continued. "But before we do that, there's something important I think deserves recognition." The applause faded. Several executives exchanged glances. The CEO looked down at the documents. This week, while preparing for tonight, I reviewed the records from one of the most important projects in our company's history. Immediately, people knew which project he meant. The contract crisis, the operational turnaround, the project that launched Ryan's career. The CEO turned a page. When people tell success stories, they usually remember the person standing in front of the room. A few guests nodded, Ryan included. Then the CEO added, "What they often forget is the person who actually built the solution." The atmosphere changed instantly, not dramatically, subtly, enough to make people pay closer attention. The CEO continued reading from the folder. Implementation reports, approval records, operational reviews, technical assessments. Every document pointed back to the same project. Then he paused. One name appears throughout nearly every critical stage of development. For the first time all evening, Ryan looked uncomfortable, not nervous, uncomfortable. The CEO closed the folder slowly, then looked across the ballroom, past the executives, past the managers, toward the back of the room, toward me. "I think this company has spent the last 5 years celebrating only part of the story." Nobody spoke. The room had become completely silent. Even my mother looked confused now. The CEO adjusted the microphone, then smiled slightly. "The person most responsible for designing that operational system isn't sitting at the front of this room." A murmur spread through the audience. People began looking around, trying to figure out who he meant. I felt my stomach tighten, because suddenly I knew where this was going, and so did Ryan. His smile was completely gone now. The CEO raised his eyes. Would Ethan Carter please stand up? And in an instant, every head in the ballroom turned toward me. For a second, nobody moved. Neither did I. More than 200 people were staring in my direction. Executives, managers, clients, even my parents. The CEO smiled. "Please, Ethan." Slowly, I stood. A wave of whispers immediately spread through the ballroom. People looked confused. Some looked curious. Most looked toward Ryan, trying to understand why the quiet operations director standing near the back of the room had suddenly become the center of attention. The CEO waited for the room to settle. Then he opened the folder again. Over the last week, my team reviewed the original records from the 2019 contract recovery project. He held up several documents. Implementation approvals. Another stack. Operational design reviews. Then another. System deployment reports. The room remained silent. Every eye stayed fixed on him. One thing became very clear. He looked directly at me. The person who designed the routing framework, developed the recovery model, and coordinated implementation across the distribution network was not Ryan Carter. A ripple moved through the audience, small at first, then larger. People started exchanging looks. Several executives frowned. Others appeared genuinely shocked. The CEO continued. It was Ethan Carter. The ballroom froze. I glanced toward my parents. My mother's expression had gone completely blank. My father looked stunned, like he had just heard a fact that didn't fit the story he'd believed for years. Then I looked at Ryan. For the first time in my life, he seemed unable to find the right words. The CEO wasn't finished. In fact, Ethan's name appears on nearly every major operational document connected to the project. He paused, then added, "Without Ethan's work, that contract would likely have been lost." The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause, because everyone in the room understood what those words meant. The project wasn't just part of Ryan's success story. It was the foundation of it. And suddenly, the foundation didn't look nearly as solid as people had assumed. Across the ballroom, I saw Karen Whitmore quietly nod, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. And judging by the look on Ryan's face, he knew the night was no longer under his control. The CEO allowed the silence to linger, long enough for people to absorb what they had just heard. Then he opened the folder again. There's something else everyone should know. Nobody looked away. Not anymore. A few minutes earlier, this had been Ryan's promotion party. Now it felt like the entire room was watching a different story unfold. The CEO glanced in my direction. Ethan never once asked for credit. That statement immediately caught people's attention, because it didn't fit the narrative they were building in their heads. Most people assume that when someone is overlooked, they complain, they argue, they fight for recognition. The CEO continued. Over the last week, we reviewed years of records, emails, project notes, and management reports. He lifted a document. When leadership praised the project team, Ethan redirected the recognition to the department. Another document. When promotion reviews took place, he never mentioned his role. Then another. When executives discussed the project publicly, he never corrected anyone. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. This wasn't just becoming a story about credit anymore. It was becoming a story about character. The CEO slowly closed the folder. Real leadership isn't standing in front of success. His eyes moved across the room. It's creating success, whether anyone notices or not. The words landed heavily, especially because everyone understood who they were directed at. I looked toward Ryan. His confident smile had disappeared completely. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure of himself. Then Karen Whitmore stood from her table. I served on the Operational Review Committee 5 years ago. Every head turned toward her. I remember exactly who solved the problem. She paused, then looked directly at me. It was Ethan. The room remained silent. Karen folded her hands. The truth is, this wasn't hidden from the company. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Because they knew what she meant. The information had always existed. People simply stopped looking once they found a story they liked better. Then the CEO stepped forward again. A faint smile crossed his face. Which is why the board reached a decision this morning. Instantly, the room became silent again. Ryan looked up. My parents did too, because whatever was coming next was about to change far more than a promotion speech. The CEO waited until the room became completely silent. Then he continued. Earlier today, the board reviewed the findings from this investigation. Investigation. That single word immediately changed the atmosphere. This wasn't a casual acknowledgement anymore. This wasn't a surprise compliment added to a promotion speech. This was official. The CEO glanced down at the documents in his hands. After reviewing the original project records, management evaluations, implementation reports, and leadership recommendations, the board concluded that Ethan Carter's contribution was significantly undervalued. A ripple of whispers moved through the ballroom. Ryan stared toward the stage without saying a word. My mother looked completely lost, as if the evening had suddenly stopped following the version she had imagined for months. The CEO continued. For years, this company benefited from Ethan's work. He paused. And for years, we failed to recognize it properly. Nobody interrupted. Nobody could. Because every executive in the room understood the same thing. The evidence had already been reviewed. The discussion was over. The decision had already been made. Then the CEO smiled slightly. Which is why the board voted unanimously this morning. The room fell silent again. I could hear glasses being placed on tables, chairs shifting, people leaning forward, waiting. The CEO looked directly at me. Effective next month, Ethan Carter will join the Executive Operations Council as Senior Vice President of Strategic Logistics. For a moment, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. The audience froze. Then came the reaction. Not whispers, not confusion. Applause, loud applause. Several executives stood first, then department directors, then managers. Within seconds, a large part of the ballroom was on its feet. Some of them were smiling, others were nodding. A few looked genuinely relieved, as if they finally had permission to acknowledge something they had known for years. I looked toward Karen. She was applauding. So were the board members. Then I looked at Ryan, and that was the moment I knew everything had changed. Not because of the promotion, not because of the title, but because for the first time in our lives, the most influential people in the room weren't listening to Ryan anymore. They were listening to me. And across the ballroom, my parents sat completely speechless. Because the son they had spent years introducing as the quiet one had just become the person everyone wanted to meet. The applause continued long after the CEO announced my promotion. Not polite applause, real applause. The kind that comes when people suddenly realize they've misunderstood a story for years. I remained standing near the back of the ballroom, unsure how to react. For most of my career, I had avoided attention whenever possible. I liked solving problems. I liked building systems. I liked finishing work and moving on to the next challenge. Standing in front of 200 people was never part of the plan. Then the CEO smiled and motioned toward the stage. Ethan, come join us. A path opened through the crowd. People stepped aside as I walked forward. Managers nodded. Executives smiled. Several employees I recognized from the original project quietly applauded as I passed. When I reached the stage, the CEO shook my hand and handed me a microphone. The room became silent. I looked out across the ballroom, at the leadership team, at the board members, at my parents, at Ryan. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. Then I took a breath and spoke. Honestly, I didn't expect any of this. A few people laughed softly. Neither had I. The truth is, that project wasn't built by one person. I paused. It was built by a lot of talented people working very long hours. Several employees nodded, because they remembered. The late nights, the emergency calls, the constant pressure, the uncertainty. I continued. I was fortunate to be part of that team. The audience listened carefully. Then someone near the front raised a question. If that's true, why didn't anyone know your role? The room grew quiet again. I thought about the answer. Then I gave the only honest one I had, because I assumed the work would speak for itself. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some people smiled. Others exchanged looks. The answer sounded simple, maybe too simple, but it was true. I never chased recognition. I never asked for credit. I believed results mattered more than attention. For years, I convinced myself that was enough. Then the CEO stepped forward again. I'd like to add something. He turned toward the audience. When our team reviewed the original project files, we weren't looking for a hidden story. He held up the folder. We were simply trying to understand how the project succeeded. The room listened closely. And the deeper we looked, the more one name continued to appear. He glanced toward me. Not because Ethan demanded recognition. A pause. Because he earned it. The audience applauded again. Then the CEO turned toward Ryan. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not hostile, just tense. Everyone knew this conversation mattered. Ryan, the CEO said calmly, is there anything you'd like to say? Ryan slowly stood. For the first time all evening, he looked uncomfortable. Not embarrassed, not angry, just tired, like someone carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. Ethan deserved more credit than he received. The room remained silent. Ryan swallowed, then continued. I should have said that years ago. No one interrupted. No one needed to. The statement landed harder than any argument could have. Because it wasn't coming from an executive or a board member. It was coming from him. Then Ryan looked around the ballroom, at the executives, at our parents, at the audience, and finally, back at me. The truth is, I got comfortable letting people believe the story. A few people lowered their eyes. Others looked genuinely surprised. Ryan gave a small nod. I'm sorry. Just 2 words. Simple, direct, and probably the most honest words he'd spoken all evening. The CEO eventually stepped forward and reclaimed the microphone. I think tonight reminds all of us of something important. The room listened. Titles matter. He paused. Recognition matters. Then he looked directly at me. But character matters most. Several executives nodded. The CEO raised his glass. To Ethan Carter. This time, the entire ballroom stood. Board members, directors, managers, employees, people who had known the truth, people who had just learned it, all applauding together. And as I looked across the room, I saw my parents sitting in complete silence. Because for the first time in my life, nobody was celebrating the son they always talked about. They were celebrating the son they never truly saw. The promotion party should have ended with everyone talking about Ryan. Instead, they were talking about me. Even after the speeches ended, people remained in the ballroom, discussing what had happened. Executives stood in small groups, comparing notes about the project. Managers talked about the investigation. Employees shared stories from years earlier. The truth had spread through the room faster than any announcement ever could. For years, everyone believed they knew the story. Tonight, they learned there had been another version all along. I spent the next hour shaking hands. People I barely knew suddenly wanted conversations. Senior leaders asked about projects I was managing. Department heads discussed future plans. Several employees from the original contract recovery team stopped to congratulate me. What surprised me wasn't the attention. It was the relief. Many of them already knew pieces of the truth. They had simply never seen anyone acknowledge it publicly. Eventually, the crowd began to thin. That's when my parents walked over. For a moment, none of us spoke. My father looked uncomfortable. My mother looked lost, like she was trying to understand how the evening had unfolded so differently from what she expected. Finally, my father broke the silence. I didn't know. 3 simple words, but they carried years of meaning. I nodded. I know. My father had never been the one making comparisons. He had simply gone along with them. For years, the family spotlight pointed toward Ryan, and eventually, everyone accepted that as normal. Then my mother spoke. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at her for several seconds. There were dozens of answers I could have given. I could have mentioned the family dinners, the interrupted conversations, the times people lost interest the moment I talked about work. Instead, I gave the simplest answer. I didn't think you wanted to hear it. The silence afterward felt heavy, because she understood exactly what I meant. For years, my accomplishments never fit the story she preferred. Ryan was the success story. Ryan was the future executive. Ryan was the son she proudly introduced. Everything else became background noise. My mother lowered her eyes. For once, she didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. And somehow that meant more than an apology. A few minutes later, Ryan joined us. The ballroom was nearly empty now. Just a handful of guests remained. Ryan looked exhausted, not angry, not defensive, just exhausted. He stopped in front of me and shook his head. You know what's funny? I waited. I spent years thinking recognition was the same thing as value. He laughed quietly. And tonight I realized they're not even close. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ryan looked toward the stage where the celebration had taken place. I should have said something years ago. Maybe he should have. Maybe I should have. But there wasn't much point revisiting the past now. The truth was already out. Ryan extended his hand. Just 2 brothers standing in a nearly empty ballroom. After a brief pause, I shook it. The gesture didn't fix everything. It didn't erase years of resentment. It didn't magically repair the family. But it was honest. And sometimes honesty is the first step toward fixing what pride broke. Later that night, I stepped outside the hotel alone. For the first time all evening, everything was quiet. My phone buzzed. A text message from Karen. 3 words. About time, I laughed. Then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Because the strange thing about that night wasn't the promotion. It wasn't the title. It wasn't even the standing ovation. The most important moment happened when someone finally looked past the spotlight, past the assumptions, past the story everyone preferred, and focused on the work itself. For years, I thought being overlooked meant I wasn't visible enough. That night taught me something different. Sometimes people see exactly who you are, They simply choose to focus on someone else. Eventually, that choice becomes their mistake. As I stood outside looking across the city, I realized I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. Free from comparisons. Free from expectations. Free from needing approval from people who had already decided who I was. Back inside, the final guests were leaving. The party was over. The story everyone believed was over too. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away as the forgotten son. I was walking away as myself. Looking back, the biggest lesson from that night had nothing to do with promotions, nothing to do with titles, and nothing to do with applause. For years, I thought being overlooked meant I needed to work harder, achieve more, prove myself. I believed that if I kept delivering results, people would eventually notice, eventually respect me, eventually see me for who I really was. But I was wrong. The people who underestimate you don't always do it because they lack evidence. Sometimes they do it because they've already decided who you are. In my family story, Ryan was the successful son. Ryan was the future executive. Ryan was the person everyone expected to win. I was simply the quiet brother in the background, the dependable one, the son nobody really talked about. What changed that night wasn't my value. My value had been there all along. What changed was visibility. The truth finally became impossible to ignore. And sometimes that's all recognition really is. Not becoming someone new, but finally being seen for who you've always been. The promotion was meaningful. The applause was nice, but neither mattered as much as walking away knowing I no longer needed anyone else's approval. Because real confidence begins the moment you stop asking other people to decide your worth. So let me ask you something. If your own family spent years overlooking your achievements, then suddenly recognized your value after everyone else did, would you ever trust them the same way again? Comment 1 if you would give them another chance. Comment 2 if some wounds never fully heal. I want to know what you honestly think.